seated.
Christ is risen.
Truly is risen.
Christos anesti.
Christos anesti.
Amusit kam.
Hakam.
Brothers and sisters in Christ, we are on the third Sunday of Pascha. We count that with including Pascha Sunday last week, which was Thomas Sunday, and then today, the Sunday of Joseph, righteous Nicodemus, and most importantly, the Myrrhbearers. What's interesting about this particular Sunday and the gospel reading that we just heard, part of me thinks that there's a way in which you can title any homily for this Sunday as the absent Jesus. This is the one Sunday during the year where Jesus in the gospel reading is not present doing something or speaking. We have that little piece that is given to us again from Holy Week. And so we begin with the story of Great and Holy Friday. Christ has died on the cross. And what happens at that point? And so we hear about these two men. In this particular gospel reading, which is from the Gospel of Mark, we only hear about Joseph of Arimathea. But of course, in the commemoration for the day, we hear about righteous Nicodemus as well. And Nicodemus is talked about in the Gospel of John in relaying the events that happen here. So the circumstances that we have go back to some of what I preached on Sunday of the Cross at Mid-Lent. I spoke at length about crucifixion. How crucifixion was a humiliating death in the first century. And it was a punishment meted out by the Roman government. And it was meted out basically to send a message. If you cause trouble for the Roman government, this is what will happen to you. And so it was not just an excruciating way to die, but it was also an example that was given to the other people. And what was normative is those that were crucified were left on the cross. Days, weeks, months. And so when people walked by, they would see the horror of what would happen. And part of why this resonated as such a bad thing for the Jewish people at that time is the custom for Jewish people was the same day that someone has died, you bury them. And so it was this thing that was at odds there. And you add to that, this crucifixion is outside of Jerusalem, right before this major festival that's happening the next day. Passover. The recounting of the deliverance of the Hebrew people from the oppression by the Egyptian Pharaoh. Moses, Red Sea, all of that. And what's more, that Feast of Passover was happening on Saturday, the Sabbath day. So that was an important day for all of the people in Jerusalem. So the prospect of having crucified people outside the gates was a bit much as well. But we hear about Joseph of Arimathea and what he did. And we hear in this reading that he was part of that council of Jewish elders, the Sanhedrin. So he had a certain position within that community of Jerusalem. He was also a secret disciple of Jesus Christ. He didn't vote with the Sanhedrin to have Jesus crucified, but he was present for that. So, of course, he was horrified at this prospect of Jesus, who he had secretly followed, remaining on that cross. And so he took a risk. Because, of course, the practice, as I said, for the Roman government was you just leave people there. But because of his position, he could make the argument, can we just remove that body and we'll put it away? He didn't get into any of the details about it. But he went to Pilate and asked the Roman government. And it was within Pilate's realm to permit that. And he did in this instance. So we hear that what Joseph did is he went and he got the body and he buried it. Now the piece we don't have in our reading from Mark, which is in John, is he was assisted by Nicodemus. And Nicodemus is another one of those secret disciples. He's presented earlier in the Gospel of John. He has this whole conversation at night, kind of like in hiding with Jesus. It's the whole conversation about being born again, and Jesus introducing the idea of baptism as being born again. And we hear that Nicodemus, in that story in John, gets 100 pounds of myrrh and aloes, all of these spices and fragrant items, to bury Jesus. Now there's an urgency as well. We hear in the stories of the crucifixion that Jesus was put on the cross in the 6th hour. So that's first century way of counting time. That was noon, our time. And then he died on the 9th hour, which is 3 in the afternoon, the way we calculate time contemporarily. And they had until sundown, because at sundown is when the Sabbath and the celebration of Passover would begin. So they had a few hours to retrieve the body, do this hasty preparation with these myrrhs and aloes, and bury Jesus. So it was kind of this hasty thing, but they got the job done. And we hear that while they're doing this, some of the women in Jesus' entourage were watching. And so they saw that the body was taken down. They saw that it was prepared. They saw that it was put in a tomb. Now keep in mind that the women probably didn't know Joseph and Nicodemus, secret disciples. They probably met with Jesus only in secret. And they weren't participating in this bigger thing of, apostles, disciples, women going from place to place. But they at least saw that someone took care of Jesus' body. And I know we have tropes about how men do things and how women do things. And I think there is a little element here. They probably saw how the body was prepared and went, oh no, these men just kind of did this thing. But they committed, and they said, we have to observe the Sabbath. We have to observe the feast. But we'll return on Sunday morning, and we'll redo the job, and we'll do the job properly. And so that is the second half of the story that we hear. But it's a surprise. Their expectation is they're going to go and take care of this just messy thing and clean it up and do it properly. And their biggest concern as they're walking to the tomb and they're carrying all of these spices is, well, those men, they put this big rock in front of the door. How are we going to get that rock out of the way to get in? They were committed to going, and they were committed to taking care of this. But there was that practical thing. Well, how do we get in there? How do we do this? And they arrived for something very unexpected. And I think I can stop here and kind of highlight something very specific about all of these people. Joseph, Nicodemus, and all of the Myrrhbearing women. They were in the same place that the apostles were in terms of Jesus was killed. I know we hear this thing about resurrection, but they were in shock of that. Jesus was dead. And it probably hadn't sank in the reality. He said this thing about resurrection. Is this really going to happen? And so what they were doing was, this is just the proper thing to do when somebody dies. And so when those women arrived at that tomb, they didn't expect what they came upon. They thought they were going to have to figure out how to move this rock, get in there, clean up this thing that Joseph and Nicodemus hastily did, do it properly, clean up all the trash, throw it away, and close the tomb again. And that would be the end of it. But instead, they come to an empty tomb. The absent Jesus, as it were, when I started. The rocks moved away from the tomb. Jesus' body is not in the tomb. And what's more, it's not just an empty tomb. They encounter an angel. And the angel is calling them into task. Why are you coming here to embalm a body? That's for dead things. Jesus isn't dead. He's risen. Go tell everybody. And then, of course, the reading ends with just this thing that I think is very natural. We came expecting one thing, empty tomb, angel talks to us, tell everyone Jesus is risen. That's a bit much. I can understand why in that moment they were afraid. We don't know what to do. This is like a shock upon a shock. But we hear in the subsequent to this, in the Gospel of Mark and in the other Gospels, is that it starts right away. People start seeing the risen Lord. And it continues. So that this Sunday is something of the Sunday of the supporting characters. No apostles are involved. They're all still hiding. They had no part in this at all. And if these supporting characters didn't do what was proper, this is speculative on my part. But I can imagine, well, Jesus probably still would have been left on that cross. I know that's not part of the bigger plan that God had in the resurrection. But just in human terms, nobody would have taken care of what needed to be taken care of. So we have those supporting characters that do that. And it's primarily on the women, because they saw what was happening. They knew that something more needed to be done than what they saw on that Friday afternoon. They prepared, and they came back to do the job on Sunday morning. Diligence. This is just the proper thing to do. We followed this man for 3 years. We were part of this entourage. And even though all of the stuff about resurrection isn't sinking in, he died, and he deserves a proper burial. And they showed up to take care of that. And it wasn't a reward, but due to their diligence and showing up, they were the first witnesses of the resurrection. And what's more, the angel tasked them. You need to go tell everyone else. And of course, we hear kind of all of these things that happen. The reading that we had at Orthodox this morning is the account from the Gospel of Luke. And so it gives that thing of the Myrrhbearing women going and finding the apostles and telling them. And we hear in that reading that most of the apostles thought it was an idle tale. Think again of the tropes. These are hysterical women saying hysterical things. Peter, though, said, well, I think I need to go check this out. So Peter went and looked in the tomb. I think there's an element of humor in the Gospel of John, because you hear, John wrote this Gospel, and he says, well, I went with Peter, and we both ran to get there, but I got there first. Kind of like, well, I beat Peter here. So it's a little bit humorous. But it's still in this context of they go to check what the Myrrhbearing women told them. And then they discover that the tomb is empty. And throughout that day, of course that first evening, Jesus begins appearing to everyone as the risen Lord. And we hear all of these things, like we heard last Sunday in the story of Thomas. We have those two parts. The first Sunday, the Pascha Sunday. Then the following week, the Thomas Sunday, when Thomas was present. And that all was started by the supporting characters, the Myrrhbearing women. So this Sunday, and what I just related to you, is a bit of a switch. Because nowhere in this, as I said, is Jesus front and center in doing anything in the reading that we hear. But we return to that. So we have this little respite, if you want to call it, this particular Sunday. And then next week, we get back into the Gospel of John, and it's primarily healing stories or encounters that Jesus has. And as I've shared, the perspective of the Gospel of John is very emphatically written post-resurrection and making the point. You can only understand these things as evidence of Jesus Christ risen from the dead. And you can only understand it as he is God incarnate and has the power to do this. So next Sunday we'll hear about Jesus healing the paralyzed man who's been at this pool in Jerusalem year after year and hasn't been healed. And then we'll hear a story about Jesus encountering the Samaritan woman and letting her know that he's the true Messiah and that both the Jews and the Samaritans are kind of missing the mark at this point in time. And then we hear the story about Jesus Christ healing the man born blind, again, in Jerusalem. So all of that really starts with what we're talking about here. These women finding the empty tomb and given the task and responsibility. Share this with everyone else and having it take off from there. Christ is risen.
Truly he is risen.